Okay, let's talk about perimeter and area in the coordinate plane. So the first thing that we need to talk about, and it's cut off part of my screen, shoot, is distance and midpoint formulas. So since this is the second semester of geometry, they're assuming you remember covering midpoint and distance in the first semester of geometry. So we're going to go through an example here so that we can kind of remember those. So let's take a look. Okay, so let's find the distance and midpoint for the segments with endpoints 1, -2, and -3, 4. So if you don't already have them, you will want to put these two formulas in your notes. This first one is for the distance between 2 points, and the second one down here is for the midpoint, the middle between 2 points. Okay. Now again, when you look at these formulas, don't get confused by the x1 and the x2. X2 just means the x part of the second point. X1 is the x part of the first point. So see the 2 points they were using? They called them x1 and x2. This is point 1, so it's the first x and the first y. This is point 2, it's the second x and the second y. Okay, so when you see the 2's and 1's, the little ones down underneath, that tells you what point the number is coming from. Let's try out the distance formula. Okay, so here we go. Let's use the formula. The distance is equal to the square root of x2. Now x2 means the x from our second point. Remember, all points are x comma y. So here's our second point, and the x is the first coordinate. So -3 is what we put first. Minus, okay, the x from our first point. Here's our first point, and the x value is 1, so -1. Then it says to put squared, so I'm going to put a little squared right there, and a plus. New parenthesis. Now it says y2, which means the y from the second point. So here's our second point. The y from that point is 4. Minus y1. So the y from our first, here's our first point, the y value is -2, so we minus -2 squared. Okay, so we've got the distance formula set up. Now we just need to carefully evaluate it. The first thing you're going to do is parentheses. So let's look in our parentheses, and the first thing I notice is here, I ended up with a minus a negative. Remember our rules for math, minus a negative becomes plus. Okay, and down here, when I combine these, so I start with my first part, -3 minus 4 is -4. I'm going to be squaring that. Plus 4 plus 2 gives me 6 squared. Okay, next step, let's evaluate a little bit more. Let's go ahead and square. Now, please remember that to square means to take something times itself. It does not mean to multiply by 2. Okay, so -4 squared means -4 times -4, which is a positive 16. 6 squared means 6 times 6, which is 36. We keep going. Now let's add those two numbers together. 16 plus 36 is 52. And we'll take the square root of 52. We get our answer about 7.2. I'm going to go ahead and round it off. So the distance between the point 1, -2 and -3, 4 is 7.2. We're going to be using this when we're finding lengths of sides to find our areas and things like that in this lesson, and to determine what type of shape they are. All right, now let's do the slope. Now the slope of a line tells you how slanted it is. Basically, so it tells you how steep a line is. It tells you whether you have a line that's going up really fast like that one, or maybe you're having a line that's kind of shallow, not real fast, not very big slope like this one. See, it's not going up very fast. If it's negative slope, it tells you the line is going down. Okay, so that's what the slope of the line tells us. It tells us where the line is headed and how fast it is headed there. The formula for slope, notice, is y2 minus y1. Again, we have those little 1s and 2s at the bottom of the number. When they're at the bottom of the number, it just is telling you which point it's coming from, the first point or the second point. And really, if you get them in the opposite order, as long as you get them both, that way you'll be okay. So let's take a look. Let's set this up. Same points. My points are 1, -2, and -3, 4. But this time, instead of finding the distance, I'm going to find the slope. The formula says to do y2. Now remember, that remembers the y from the second point. So here's my second point. The y value was 4. Okay, so I have 4 minus is what the formula says. Then my y1, so the y from my first point. Here's my first point. The y value was -2. So I write down -2. On the bottom here, we have x2, so the x from our second point. So here's the second point they gave us, and the x from that point is -3. Minus x1, that means the x from our first point. So here's our first point. Here is the x from that point is 1. We're going to simplify this. Again, we end up with that minus, negative, make a positive, so that makes that a plus. Okay, minus and negative, remember, is addition. That's one of our rules we learned way back when. So in the top I have 4 plus 2 gives me 6 on the top of this fraction. -3 minus 1 is -4 on the bottom. And then I'm going to go ahead and reduce that. 2 will go into both 6 and 4. So I can reduce by dividing by 2. And I get negative. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. Now you may notice that I put the negative sign out in front. That's how we typically write it. We don't leave it in the top or the bottom of the fraction. Okay? We just put it out front. So for those 2 points, we were able to use the formulas and find the distance was 7.2, and the midpoint was, the slope was at -3.2. That means for every 3 units it goes down, it goes 2 units to the right. That's how our slope